Chapter 22. Meanwhile, JP was waiting for me in his nice little shack in Corte Madera, California. He was settled in Sean Monahan's Hermitage, a wooden cabin built behind a cypress windrow on a steep little grassy hill also covered with eucalyptus and pine, behind Sean's main house. The shack had been built by an old man to die in years ago. It was well built. I was invited to go live there as long as I wanted, rent-free. The shack had been made habitable after years as a wreck by Sean Monahan's brother-in-law, Whitey Jones, a good young carpenter, who had put in burlap over the wood walls and a good wood stove and a kerosene lamp, and then never lived in it, having to go to work out of town. So JP'd move in to finish his studies and live the good solitary life. If anybody wanted to go see him, it was a steep climb. On the floor were woven grass mats, and JP said in the letter, "I sit and smoke in a pipe and drink tea and hear the wind beat the slender eucalyptus limbs while whips and the cypress windrow roars." He'd stay there until May 15, his sailing date for Japan, where he had been invited by an American foundation to stay in a monastery and study under a master. Meanwhile, wrote JP, "Come share a wild man's dark cabin with wine and weekend girls and good pots of food and wood fire heat. Monahan will give us grocery bucks to fall a few trees in his big yard and a buck and split 'em out for firewood, and I'll teach you all about logging." During that winter, JP had hitchhiked up to his home country in the Northwest, up through Portland and snow, farther up to the Blue Ice Glacier country, finally northern Washington on the farm of a friend in the Nooksack Valley, a week in the berry picker's split-shake cabin, and a few climbs around. The names like Nooksack and Mount Baker National Forest excited in my mind a beautiful crystal vision of snow and ice and pines in the far north of my childhood dreams. But I was standing on the very hot April road of North Carolina, waiting for my first ride, which came very soon from a young high school kid who took me to a country town called Nashville, where I broiled in the sun a half hour till I got a ride from a taciturn but kindly naval officer who drove me clear to Greenville, South Carolina. After that whole winter and early spring of incredible peace, sleeping on my porch and resting in my woods, the stint of hitchhiking was harder than ever and more like hell than ever. In Greenville, in fact, I walked 3 miles in the burning sun for nothing, lost in the maze of downtown back streets, looking for a certain highway, and at one point passed a kind of forge where colored men were all black and sweaty and covered with coal, and I cried, "I'm suddenly in hell again," as I felt the blast of heat. But it began to rain on the road, and a few rides took me into the rainy night of Georgia, where I rested, sitting on my pack under the overhanging sidewalk roofs of old hardware stores, and drank a half pint of wine. A rainy night, no rides. When the Greyhound bus came, I hailed it down and rode to Gainesville. In Gainesville, I thought I'd sleep by the railroad tracks a while, but they were about a mile away, and just as I thought of sleeping in the yard, a local crew came out to switch and saw me. So I retired to an empty lot by the tracks. But the cop car kept circling around using its spot. Had probably heard of me from the railroad man, probably not. So I gave it up, mosquitoes anyway, and went back to town and stood waiting for a ride in the bright lights by the luncheonettes of downtown. The cops seeing me plainly, and therefore not searching for me or worrying about me. But no ride, and dawn coming. So I slept in a $4 room in a hotel and showered and rested well. But what feelings of homelessness and bleak again as the Christmas trip east. All I had to be really proud of were my fine new thick-soled work shoes and my full pack. In the morning, after breakfast in a dismal Georgia restaurant with revolving fans on the ceiling and mucho flies, I went out on the broiling highway and got a ride from a truck driver to Flowery Branch, Georgia. Then a few spot rides on through Atlanta to the other side at another small town called Stonewall, where I was picked up by a big fat southerner with a broad-brimmed hat who reeked of whiskey and kept telling jokes and turning to look at me to see if I laughed, meanwhile sending the car spurring into the soft shoulders and leaving big clouds of dust behind us. So that long before he reached his destination, I begged off and said I wanted to get off to eat. Heck, boy, I'll eat with you and drive you on. He was drunk and he drove very fast. Well, I gotta go to the toilet, I said, trailing off my voice. The experience had bugged me, so I decided, the hell with hitchhiking. I've got enough money to take a bus to El Paso, and from there, I'll hop Southern Pacific freights and be 10 times safer. Besides, the thought of being all the way out in El Paso, Texas, in that dry southwest of clear blue skies and endless desert land to sleep in, no cops, made up my mind. I was anxious to get out of the south, out of Chain Gang, Georgia. The bus came at 4 o'clock, and we were at Birmingham, Alabama in the middle of the night, where I waited on a bench for my next bus, trying to sleep on my arms on my rucksack, but kept waking up to see the pale ghosts of American bus stations wandering around. In fact, one woman streamed by like a wisp of smoke. I was definitely certain she didn't exist for sure. On her face, the phantasmal belief in what she was doing. On my face, for that matter, too. After Birmingham, it was soon Louisiana, and then East Texas oil fields, then Dallas, then a long day's ride in a bus crowded with servicemen across the long immense waste of Texas to the ends of it, El Paso, arriving at midnight. By now, I being so exhausted, all I wanted to do was sleep. But I didn't go to a hotel. I had to watch my money now, and instead I just hauled my pack to my back and walked straight for the railroad yards to stretch my bag out somewhere behind the tracks. It was then, that night, that I realized the dream that had made me want to buy the pack. It was a beautiful night, and the most beautiful sleep of my life. First, I went to the yards and walked through, warily, behind lines of boxcars, and got out to the west end of the yard, but kept going because suddenly I saw in the dark there was indeed a lot of desert land out there. I could see rocks, dry bushes, imminent mountains of them faintly in the starlight. Why hang around viaducts and tracks, I reasoned, when all I gotta do is exert a little footwork and I'll be safe out of reach of all the yard cops and bums too, for that matter. I just kept walking along the mainline track for a few miles, and soon I was in the open desert mountain country. My thick boots walked well on the ties and rocks. It was now about 1 a.m. I longed to sleep off on the long trip from Carolina. Finally, I saw a mountain to the right I liked. After passing a long valley with many lights in it distinctly a penitentiary or prison. Stay away from that yard, son, I thought. I went up a dry arroyo, and in the starlight, the sand and rocks were white. I climbed and climbed. Suddenly, I was exhilarated to realize I was completely alone and safe, and nobody was going to wake me up all night long. What an amazing revelation. And I had everything I needed right on my back. I'd put fresh bus station water in my polydenim bottle before leaving. I climbed up the arroyo, so finally when I turned and looked back, I could see all of Mexico, all of Chihuahua, the entire sand glittering desert of it, under a late sinking moon that was huge and bright just over the Chihuahua Mountains. The Southern Pacific Rail was running right, along parallel to the Rio Grande River outside of El Paso. So from where I was, on the American side, I could see right down to the river itself separating the two borders. The sand in the arroyo was soft as silk. I spread my sleeping bag on it and took off my shoes and had a slug of water and lit my pipe and crossed my legs and felt glad. Not a sound. It was still winter in the desert. Far off, just the sound of the yards where they were kicking at cuts of cars with great splone waking up all El Paso, but not me. All I had for companionship was that moon of Chihuahua sinking lower and lower as I looked, losing its white light and getting more and more yellow butter. Yet, when I turned into sleep, it was bright as a lamp in my face, and I had to turn my face away to sleep. In keeping with my naming of little spots with personal names, I called this spot Apache Gulch. I slept well indeed. In the morning, I discovered a rattlesnake trail in the sand, but that might have been from the summer before. There were very few boot marks, and those were hunter's boots. The sky was flawlessly blue in the morning, the sun hot, plenty of little dry wood to light a breakfast fire. I had cans of pork and beans in my spacious pack. I had a royal breakfast. The problem now was water, though. As I drank it all, and the sun was hot and I got thirsty. I climbed up the arroyo, investigating it further, and came to the end of it, a solid wall of rock, and at the foot of it, even deeper, softer sand than that of the night before. I decided to camp there that night, after a pleasant day spent in Old Juarez, enjoying the church and streets and food of Mexico. For a while, I contemplated leaving my pack hidden among rocks, but the chances were slim yet possible that some old hobo or hunter would come along and find it. So I hauled it on my back and went down the arroyo to the rails again, and walked back 3 miles until El Paso, and left the pack in a 25-cent locker in the railroad station. Then I walked along through the city and out to the border gate, and crossed over for 2 pennies. It turned out to be an insane day, starting sanely enough in the Church of Mary Guadalupe, and a saunter in the Indian markets, and resting on park benches among the gay, childlike Mexicans. But later, the bars and few too many to drink, yelling at old mustachioed Mexican peons. Todas las granas de arena del desierto de Chihuahua son vacuidad. And finally, I ran into the bunch of evil Mexican Apaches of some kind who took me to their dripping stone pad and turned me on by candlelight and invited their friends, and it was all a lot of shadowy heads by candlelight and smoke. In fact, I got sick of it and remembered my perfect white sand gulch and the place where I would sleep tonight, and I excused myself. But they didn't want me to leave. One of them stole a few things from my bag of purchases, but I didn't care. One of the Mexican boys was queer and had fallen in love with me and wanted to go to California with me. It was night now in Juarez. All the nightclubs were wailing away. We went for a short beer in one nightclub, which was exclusively Negro soldiers sprawling around with senoritas in their laps, a mad bar with rock and roll on the jukebox, a regular paradise. The Mexican kid wanted me to go down alleys and go and tell American boys that I knew where there were some girls. Then I bring them to my room. No girls, said the Mexican kid. The only place I could shake him was at the border gate. We waved goodbye, but it was the evil city, and I had my virtuous desert waiting for me. I walked anxiously over the border and through El Paso and out to the railroad station, got my bag out, heaved a big sigh, and went right on down those 3 miles to the arroyo, which was easy to recognize in the moonlight, and on up, my feet making that lonely thwop-thwop of Japhy's boots, and I realized I had indeed learned from Japhy how to cast off the evils of the world and the city and find my true, pure soul, just as long as I had a decent pack on my back. I got back to my camp and spread the sleeping bag and thanked the Lord for all he was giving me. Now the remembrance of the whole long evil afternoon, smoking marijuana with slant-hatted Mexicans in a musty candlelit room was like a dream, a bad dream, like one of my dreams on the straw mat at Buda Creek, North Carolina. I meditated and prayed. There just isn't any kind of night's sleep in the world that can compare with the night's sleep you get in the desert winter night, providing you're good and warm in a duck-down bag. The silence is so intense that you can hear your own blood roar in your ears, but louder than that by far is the mysterious roar, which I always identify with the roaring of the diamond of wisdom, the mysterious roar of silence itself, which is a great reminding you of something you've seemed to have forgotten in the stress of your days since birth. I wish I could explain it to those I loved, to my mother, to Japhy, but there just weren't any words to describe the nothingness and purity of it. Is there a certain and definite teaching to be given to all living creatures? Was the question probably asked to beetle-browed, snowy Dipankara, and his answer was the roaring silence of the diamond.